The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. An Odyssey to Jerusalem. By Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Bryan Godwin. Part 2. Peace of Mind. Our journey to Jerusalem would prove to be arduous and lengthy, which was already apparent at the port of London. We reached our ship as it was about to leave the harbor, and despite the cold weather, beads of sweat were now running down my forehead. Mycroft had come to bid farewell, and provided us with the necessary financial resources, as well as official cover letters for the Ottoman authorities with whom we were supposed to collaborate. Train tickets and hotel reservations would already await us at the respective location. And so we boarded the HMS Battledore, I for my part totally out of breath, and Holmes in complete serenity. The crossing of the English Channel was uneventful. In our cabin I studied the investigation files handed out by Mycroft as well. They actually proved to be quite insignificant, as Holmes had already attested. The listed attacks were minor, mostly property damage, which in some cases was quite extensive. Injuring or even killing people has apparently not been on the terrorists' agenda so far. The police station, which had been set on fire, was abandoned even some time before the crime, so this too was more of a symbolic act. But the documents also conveyed that these activities caused a stir and a topic of discussion among the Palestinian population. Although nothing was known about the initiator, there should be tacit support amongst the population, because the Ottoman administration had long since proven to be unsuitable to lead the Middle East to prosperity. There were economic and social problems, which, of course, were a good breeding ground not only for resistance activities, but also for a positive response among the people of Jerusalem and the surrounding area. The concern about the Ottoman administration could end up in chaos under the given pressure, that it threatened to collapse, and that the Sultan's rule would be overthrown was by no means unfounded. As I leafed through the files, Holmes brooded over a map of Jerusalem, on which he apparently put markings with a pencil. "What are you doing?" I finally asked after watching him for a few minutes. Holmes looked up and explained, "I am getting acquainted with the geography of the city and the surrounding area. It's easy to get lost in the narrow streets of the old town. I'm also trying to figure out a pattern regarding the locations of the attacks." "And," I added, "any findings?" But Holmes shook his head. "There's none. The crime scenes seemed arbitrarily selected, which is undoubtedly a good decision for underground activities. After all, you don't want to leave any tracks, you want to cover them up. I think there are smart people at work here who operate with almost military and intelligence precision. It's not going to be so easy to track them down." I walked up to my friend and looked over his shoulder. A place of attack made no sense to me either. They were all scattered all over the city. "Well," I said laconically, "it would probably have been too easy if the crime scenes were simply along the stations of the Via Dolorosa. When we are already there, however, we should still take the time to follow the Way of Sorrows. That is what the majesty of the place dictates." "We're not making a pilgrimage here," Holmes replied. "What else do you want to visit? The Mount of Olives? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre?" "But of course," I replied quickly. "I don't go to Jerusalem and ignore the importance of this city, and I'm by no means limiting myself to those sacred places for Christians. You know the Jewish custom of putting small pieces of paper with prayers or wishes in the cracks at the Wailing Wall, don't you? I don't want to miss out on getting in touch with God there." "Hocus pocus," Holmes replied. "You might as well throw a penny into a wishing well that brings you just as close to God." I shook my head decisively. "Do you have no respect for the city of peace, the sacred center of the world? Do you feel reverence for God?" Holmes rose from his chair and looked at me seriously. "My relationship with God is a private matter," he explained. "And if you ask me, the center of the world is currently in the city of London. That's where the big decisions are made. That's where everything comes from. London is the real Alpha and Omega." "But I'm not talking about the profane world," I said, slightly annoyed. This is about something much greater than the Empire, which can hardly be grasped by earthly standards, and with yours, apparently, certainly not. Calm down, Watson, Holmes said slowly. If you hope to come closer to your peace of mind in Jerusalem, we will of course take our time, but you won't find the kingdom of heaven there. God has long since left this place. I was still irritated. How can you say something like that? I asked reproachfully. Holmes folded his hands and said, I've been to Jerusalem, an insignificant small town with no grandeur. It is dirty, antiquated, and full of godless criminals. This might as well be a paradise for you, I said, since all you care about is your investigations. The more crime and barbarism, the better for your personal bliss. But no, my dear Watson, Holmes disagreed. I am quite willing to acknowledge the historical importance of Jerusalem. If you wish, I'll be happy to visit a few ruins with you. I can even be of assistance to you as a little guide regarding your touristic and religious interests. Thank you. No, I declined the offer. We will focus on our mission, and if there is time in between, I will set off on my own. At most, you are a disruptive factor. Or worse, you might get us in trouble for trying to prove there is nothing but soil under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I do hope so, Holmes replied. In the sense of the resurrection, the tomb must be empty. It would be highly unpleasant for Christianity if the bones of Jesus were dug up there. The Pope, the Byzantine Patriarch, and our Archbishop of Canterbury would all have to abdicate and close their churches immediately. No, Watson, we better not look under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but maybe elsewhere? It can be assumed that all sorts of objects, artifacts, and relics of archaeological interest can be found below the city. That has to appeal to you as an educated man. Who knows? Perhaps we will make an epical discovery by the way and recover the Ark of the Covenant, or the Holy Grail. Leave these jokes, I replied rather harshly, but gathered myself quickly only to continue. You know as well as I do that the Grail has been in England for centuries. We both started laughing, and the tense situation resolved. You are right, Holmes concluded. We will postpone the search for the Grail for the time being, but start immediately upon our return. I spent the rest of the crossing on deck, looking at the turbulent, gloomy sea. It corresponded to my inner life at that time. The fact that Holmes showed no sense of Jerusalem, or at least outwardly, annoyed me to some extent. He had never told me about a previous trip to the Middle East that he mentioned earlier. Of course, it was possible that the events of this stay had led to his now attitude, which is why I resolved to ask on occasion. However, it was also conceivable that Holmes had his reasons to conceal one or the other information about his past even to me, and did not want to change this approach. This, of course, should be respected. When the Belgian coast came into view, it was already getting dark. Mycroft had chosen the slightly longer route to Ostend instead of Calais for us, because from there the subsequent train connection to the southeast would be more direct and thus faster. Holmes didn't leave our cabin until we entered the harbor. To my surprise, he had already brought our suitcases with him when he appeared on deck. I saw this as a small gesture to apologize for his lack of empathy, and acknowledged this with a short thank you. Inevitably, we had to focus on our mission, which is why missionary tendencies on my part were indeed out of place. At least I had become aware of this while watching the waves outside on the railing. We took a carriage to the central train station of Ostend. It was already evening when we boarded our train, which would take us to Vienna during the course of the night, where we had to change again. Hence, we found ourselves in the feeder to the Orient Express, which was established 10 years ago, whose actual starting point was, of course, Paris. 2 smaller separate compartments in the sleeping car were reserved for us in the far less glamorous Belgian train. The route to Vienna led via Brussels, Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg to the center of the Habsburg Empire, where the Austrian king of Jerusalem, whom I had already jokingly mentioned, resided in the castle of Schönbrunn. The irony was that we would board the train to Constantinople in the city, which had been besieged twice unsuccessfully by the Turks, with world historical consequences. Austria and the Ottoman Empire had been mortal enemies for centuries, mostly in the struggle over spheres of influence in the Balkans. But in the meantime, there was a political rapprochement. The possibility of a direct train connection between the two metropolises may be seen as a certain expression of this recent development, which caused concern from the point of view of the Empire, as Mycroft had already mentioned to us. The compartment was small but adequate. For a long time I looked out of the window, lost in thought. A rather monotone and plain landscape was passing by. I barely noticed how the sun went down and the night took over. When we arrived in Brussels, rather abrupt, I was startled by my trance-like state. The memory of our precarious mission abroad in the Belgian capital suddenly rose in me when Holmes and I were traveling incognito on behalf of Her Majesty more than a decade ago. In retrospect, not exactly my favorite adventure, which is why I always remained skeptical when Mycroft once again presented us with a secret government order. So it was in this case, in the current case, where the matter would lead us not only across the Channel, but to the Middle East. I had extremely mixed, not to be said pessimistic feelings, which were not exactly suppressed by the events of Brussels at the time. We almost disappeared forever in a dungeon, but that was before the interim death of my friend at the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, which later turned out to be a temporary disappearance, which also implied stressful emotions and thoughts. It was still not easy for me to deal with this questionable episode, although of course there were good reasons for this charade. Nevertheless, trust looks different. I finally went to bed, if you can call the berth and thin mattress of an ordinary Belgian sleeping car a bed, and tried to fall asleep quickly. I was not surprised that I still heard Holmes walking around next door, and sometimes murmuring the one or other incomprehensible word. Even in his small train compartment, he obviously kept moving to organize his thoughts. Other neighbors might have been bothered by this, but for me, the sounds were reassuring because they marked the reliable presence and alert mind of my friend. And so, I was already sleeping soundly when the train crossed the border between Belgium and Germany.